You stand in a stone corridor thick with candle smoke and prayer. The scent of scorched tallow and spiced wine hangs in the air like a warning. Your breath fogs in the February chill, though fires roar in every hearth. Outside, the Thames groans beneath a sheet of ice. Inside, Richmond Palace pulses like a living creature, walls trembling with footsteps, servants rushing past, faces taut with hope and dread. Then, scream. Not of terror, but of labor. Of something ancient and violent tearing its way into the world. Catherine of Aragon is somewhere behind the thick oak door, shrouded in tapestries and incense, surrounded by women who whisper psalms while gripping bloodied linens. Her body, fragile from years of failure and royal expectation, heaves with the strain of bringing forth England's future. And there, pacing just outside, Henry. Not yet the tyrant. Not yet the bloated monarch who will spill wives' blood like wine. No, this is Henry as few remember him, 20, athletic, golden-haired, trembling. His boots scuff the floor in anxious rhythm. His lips move in silent prayer. This is not a king tonight. This is a man terrified of fate. Then, silence. One long, unnatural silence. Followed by the thin, sharp wail of a newborn. A boy. A prince. The sound cuts through the hall like a blade, clean, perfect, undeniable. You see Henry freeze. His eyes widen. A steward bolts through the door, breathless, pale, but smiling. The king crumples, not in weakness, but in something older than power, relief. He weeps. Not quietly. He falls to his knees and weeps with the full-bodied release of a man who believes his dynasty is now immortal. And for a time, it is. The prince is healthy. Male. Loud. Fair-haired like his father, with a cry that echoes off stone walls and tapestried chambers. England erupts. Bells toll for 3 days straight. Bonfires are lit on every hill from Dover to York. Foreign dignitaries send gold and relics. Poets scribble verses. Bishops declare it divine providence. The Tudor line, once fragile, now seems ironclad. For 52 days, the kingdom drinks deeply from the cup of certainty. Then one morning, the cradle is still. No wail. No breath. No sound but the rustle of silk as nurses check again and again for signs of life that refuse to return. You don't hear the child's death. You feel it. In the cold breath of the wind that slips through the shuttered windows. In the tightening grip of a midwife's hands. In the way Henry screams when the truth finally reaches him. The boy who was to be Henry IX, whose birth ignited the greatest celebration England had seen in a generation, dies with no warning, no explanation, no cause but nature's cruelty. And from the moment his lungs go still, nothing in England will ever be the same. You are no longer in a nursery. You are standing at the mouth of a storm. The silk-draped crib becomes a coffin. The mourning becomes madness. The king becomes something else. And the death of an innocent child becomes the first thread to unravel a church, a throne, a continent. This was not just a death. This was an infection. One that would rot its way through every chapel, every marriage, every law and altar and bed. And from that cradle, rose the storm that tore England apart. If you're about to watch this entire tragedy unfold and still won't subscribe to Disturbing Tale, then at least comment below why history doesn't deserve your loyalty. He was named Henry, like his father and grandfather. But unlike them, he came into the world not as a warrior or a tactician or a king forged by survival, but as a symbol. A tiny, breathing symbol that the chaos was finally over. The boy they called Prince Henry, Duke of Cornwall, was more than just a royal infant. He was a living answer to a century of violence. A century where crowns were exchanged like daggers in the dark. Where brothers slaughtered brothers. Where England bled beneath banners stitched with red and white roses. The Wars of the Roses may have ended, but peace, true peace, remained paper-thin. And every nobleman knew it. The Tudor dynasty was new. Unsteady. Built not on ancient blood but on conquest, marriage, and luck. Henry VIII's father, Henry VII, had clawed his way to the throne at Bosworth, his right to rule soaked in battlefield mud and Lancastrian desperation. His grip on power was firm but not uncontested. Pretenders rose like weeds, Lambert Simnel, Perkin Warbeck, ghosts claiming royal blood, backed by enemies eager to plunge England back into civil war. That fear never left the royal bedchamber. Which is why this boy, this Henry, was so much more than a child. He was insurance. A shield. A prophecy fulfilled. For 2 decades, English monarchs had ruled in the shadow of fragility. But now, in the arms of a weeping king, lay certainty. The line would not break. The crown would pass from father to son. The wars would not return. And in that belief, nations moved. Spain rejoiced. Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, had done her duty, not just as queen, but as a diplomatic cornerstone. Her union with Henry VIII wasn't just a love story, it was a continental strategy. Her child, their child, was proof that England and Spain were no longer enemies, but blood-bound. France hesitated. Louis XII watched from across the Channel, calculating. If the Tudor line was now secure, then England was no longer vulnerable. It was no longer distracted. It could no longer be played. For decades, France had gambled on England's instability. Now that leverage was gone. The Holy Roman Empire watched closely. Margaret of Austria, regent of the Netherlands and aunt to the future Charles V, sent gifts, letters, and veiled offers. The boy in the cradle might one day marry a Habsburg niece or unite Catholic thrones in an unbreakable alliance. Even Rome took notice. A prince born of Spain and England, a future king bred in Catholic majesty, was the Church's best hope against rising heresies bubbling across Germany. In a chamber lined with velvet and crucifixes, an infant prince slept, while grown men redrew maps in his name. The world didn't wait for him to walk or speak. It moved because he breathed. But beneath that golden anticipation, a darker truth remained: the Tudor claim was still brittle. Henry VIII, though handsome and beloved, was only the second monarch of his line. The crown still trembled beneath his feet, held firm not by centuries of tradition, but by the iron will of his father and the fragile promise of his son. Without this baby, there was nothing but whispers and knives waiting in the dark. No amount of pageantry or wealth could disguise the truth: England's peace lived and died with the breath of this boy. He wasn't just Henry's heir. He was England's hostage to fortune. And fortune, as it often does, had its own appetite. If you're watching this and still haven't subscribed to Disturbing Tale, understand this: you're standing at the edge of history's most fragile piece, and you're refusing to blink. Subscribe now, or descend into the comments and confess why you choose silence over stories that carved the world in blood. She had been groomed to be a queen since childhood. Raised in palaces where bloodlines were scripture and her womb was the altar upon which dynasties would rise or fall. Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Spain's Catholic monarchs, had crossed the Channel not for love, but for legacy. Her body was not her own. It belonged to nations. And the weight of that inheritance was merciless. By the time she gave birth to Prince Henry, Catherine had already bled for England, again and again. Her first child, a daughter, was stillborn. Then a boy, born too early to cry. Another girl, who lived just long enough for Catherine to believe, before death came quietly in the night. By the time she carried the child who would be Duke of Cornwall, the Queen's soul had been rubbed raw by grief, failure, and constant royal scrutiny. For every pregnancy, there was a court watching. A kingdom holding its breath. Ambassadors reporting to foreign thrones. And when her womb failed to deliver what England demanded, a male heir, she was not pitied. She was interrogated. Her body became the battleground of diplomacy. They called her pious, dutiful, gracious. But what they didn't say, what the records only whisper, is how deeply the rituals of superstition and fear invaded her every moment. When her belly began to swell, relics were pinned to her undergarments, bones of saints, threads from holy vestments. She drank bitter brews made from crushed rubies and powdered antlers. Midwives placed consecrated wax figures beneath her mattress to draw down divine favor. At night, candles blessed in high mass were lit and positioned around the bed in precise order, facing east, to confuse demons that might tamper with the child's soul before birth. A white dove was once released in her chambers, its path believed to predict the outcome. When it flew into the wall and broke its neck, the midwives refused to speak. Catherine wept until her nose bled. Even her meals were dictated by myth. No eel. No hare. No wine after sunset. And absolutely no salt before the third trimester, lest the child be born cold in the bones. But superstition did not shield her from the truth. Her failures were recorded like battles, dates, hours, outcomes. Spanish envoys sent reports home that barely veiled their dread. One letter described her as hollow-eyed, slow to rise, and prone to weeping when unattended. Another warned that Her Majesty speaks of angels and hears voices in the walls. We fear the child does not stir. Still, she tried again. And again. And again. Because a queen without a son was a queen on borrowed time. And through it all, Henry smiled in public and fumed in private. His eyes drifted to younger ladies in waiting. His court grew tense. But Catherine, who had survived the death of her first husband, the political limbo of widowhood, and the humiliation of nearly being sent back to Spain, clenched her teeth and prayed louder. When at last she bore the boy who would be named Prince Henry, she had bled more for England than most soldiers ever would. But even then, the shadow never left her. She knew what silence in a cradle could mean. She had heard it before. She had buried it. And when the child she gave everything for died 52 days later, something in her never came back. Thousands of you are watching this in silence while Catherine screamed for hours to give England hope. If she gave that much, you can give a click. If not, the comment section's wide open. Let us know what's holding you back. The room where he was born stank of iron and lavender, blood and prayer. Thick velvet curtains had been drawn tight to keep out drafts, but they also kept in the heat of a dozen tallow candles, the sweat of anxious midwives, and the incense burning in bronze censers at the four corners of the chamber. Everything was damp. Everything was sacred. Catherine screamed once more, and then, a rupture. A sharp cry. Not hers. His. The cry of a living prince. The sound, thin, fierce, miraculous, bounced off the stone walls like the clang of a church bell. You could feel it in your chest. For one unbearable second, the room froze. Midwives stared. Priests crossed themselves. The queen collapsed against silken pillows, tears in her hair. And Henry, who had stormed through a dozen war rooms, who had spoken Latin and scripture with popes and generals, crumbled. He wept. Openly. Cradling the blood-slick boy in his arms, shaking with the kind of relief only men who carry the weight of nations ever feel. The child was perfect. Pale as milk, with a tuft of reddish-gold hair already matted to his tiny scalp. The cord was cut with a dagger blessed in the chapel royal. Holy water was flung like wine. A nurse whispered prayers over his head as she swaddled him in linen embroidered with Tudor roses in silver thread. Trumpets sounded. Bells rang from every steeple. By sundown, word had reached Calais. By morning, Paris. Within the week, gilded carriages bearing letters of congratulations thundered across Europe. France sent a jeweled rattle made of pure silver, mocked by some as too precious to be held by mortal hands. Spain, flush with triumph, dispatched a full diplomatic envoy. Not just for ceremony, but to secure the child's future bride, a Habsburg princess, barely born herself, meant to merge the bloodlines of the Old World. Margaret of Austria penned a letter still preserved in archives today: "God has smiled upon England. Let us make of this prince a bond that cannot be undone." Even Rome responded. A papal envoy delivered a relic of St. John the Baptist's finger to be placed beside the child's cradle. The Pope's note read simply, "May this boy walk in righteousness and bind the wounds of Christendom." But it wasn't just Europe watching. Henry's court celebrated like a kingdom possessed. Feasts erupted in every corner of the country. 30 oxen were roasted whole. Minstrels composed ballads within the hour. Gold coins were tossed into crowds of beggars who wept and kissed the king's boots. Fireworks, crude by modern standards but terrifyingly loud, shook the skies above London. Inside the palace, Henry ordered tapestries commissioned before the child had even suckled at the breast. A series of paintings depicting the prince seated beside his father, scepter in hand, the very image of continuity. To the world, this baby was not just a symbol. He was a certainty. A breathing, blinking, swaddled promise that the Tudor sun would not set. That no rival house would rise. That the ghosts of York and Lancaster would finally be buried in peace. Every breath that child took was a coronation in miniature. Every movement, watched. Every sound, recorded. And Henry, not yet cruel, not yet broken, hovered near the cradle with the awe of a man who had conquered the deepest fear a king can carry: irrelevance. This was not merely a son. This was England's future, made flesh. And yet, it would all collapse before the moon could complete its next cycle. The ink on the diplomatic letters would barely dry before it turned to obituary. The songs written in his name would become elegies. But for one shining moment, Henry wept, not in rage, not in fury, but in joy so total it could only be broken by a loss equally profound. And it was coming. If you've made it this far and still haven't subscribed to Disturbing Tale, ask yourself: are you really prepared to witness the death of a miracle and walk away unmoved? If not, then scroll down, click, and join us. And if you still won't, go to the comments and explain why not even a king's tears can make you care. He lived for exactly 52 days. Not a day more. Not a breath longer. And in those 52 days, an empire knelt before a cradle. He was never left alone. Not even for a moment. Armed guards stood outside the nursery. Servants rotated in shifts so the chamber was never cold, never dark, never quiet. Candles were kept burning at all hours. The air always smelled faintly of wax, rosewater, and the faint, sour milk of infancy. His swaddling was no ordinary cloth. It was woven in Flanders, lined with rabbit fur, embroidered with gold thread that bore the initials HR for Henricus Rex. Beneath his head lay a pillow stuffed with the down of royal swans, an animal believed to bring prophetic dreams. Around his wrist, a charm, an ivory carving of the Virgin Mary, believed to ward off fevers and death spirits that prowled the sleeping hours of noble children. His diet was a matter of obsession. The breast milk he consumed was pre-tasted by a nursemaid to ensure it wasn't poisoned. The wet nurse herself had been selected from hundreds. She was healthy, Catholic, soft-spoken, and morally unblemished, her entire lineage examined to the 3rd degree to rule out any trace of disease, deformity, or heresy. Each feeding was timed and logged. How long he suckled. Which side. Whether he burped. How long it took him to fall asleep. The color of his stool. The heat of his skin. Every biological function was treated as sacred prophecy. If he cried, how long? If he stirred, what hour? If he blinked too slowly, a physician was summoned. If he sneezed, the priest was called. And behind it all, Henry VIII, hovering like a shadow. Not the tyrant we remember. Not yet. But a father trembling at the altar of fate, scribbling in journals, questioning doctors, demanding reassurances no one dared refuse. He visited the nursery 5, 6 times a day. Sometimes in silence, standing over the cradle with eyes rimmed red and voice caught in his throat. Other times he spoke softly, telling the child stories of the battles he would one day lead, the crowns he would wear, the kingdom that would kneel to him by birthright. There were days when Henry held the boy for hours, his court silently watching as a king wrapped his arms around his legacy, terrified that blinking might mean losing him. It was not love. It was desperation masquerading as tenderness. Because Henry knew, somewhere in the marrow of his bones, that everything he had fought for, everything his father had schemed for, everything England had killed for, now existed in the fragile lungs of a child who had never spoken a word. This was not fatherhood. This was the performance of hope. But hope, when clutched too tightly, turns brittle. And when it breaks, it cuts. A nation watched that cradle the way it watched the throne. Every smile the child gave was mirrored by a noble's ambition. Every blink, every breath, a future imagined, a rebellion delayed, a policy drafted in anticipation of a monarch not yet weaned. But beneath the joy, there was fear. Because deep in the heart of the court, and deeper still in the soul of the king, was the truth: nothing was certain. And when that child stopped breathing, 52 days after his first gasp, a silence fell so complete it would echo through Henry's reign for decades. The tenderness vanished. The softness. The tears. What remained would become the executioner king, the butcher of wives, the destroyer of monasteries, the man who would murder anyone who reminded him of his own fragility. This child did not die in vain. He forged a monster. If you're deep into this story and still haven't subscribed, you're witnessing the rot of power without giving voice to truth. Either hit the button, or confess your loyalty to silence in the comments. It began with a sound. A shift so small it could have been nothing. A pause between cries, slightly longer than usual. A breath not quite as full. A softness to the infant's wail that hadn't been there the night before. But the nurse noticed. She always noticed. At first, she said nothing. After all, he fed well that morning. His eyes were open, his cheeks flush. But by nightfall, he wouldn't latch. He turned his head, whimpered faintly, then fell asleep before the breast could reach his lips. It was the kind of thing no one wanted to say aloud. Not in that palace. Not with a kingdom watching. The wet nurse reported it quietly, just a whisper to the chamber physician as he passed by. A touch of fatigue, he murmured. Perhaps too much light in the room. But the next day, the child's skin felt cool. Not cold, but noticeably less warm, as if his body no longer held the heat it should. They added more swaddling. Increased the fire in the hearth. Moved his cradle nearer to the window to catch the weak winter sun. Still, the boy didn't cry as often. And when he did, it was thin. Like a reed blowing through a church door. The palace began to tighten. You could feel it in the hallways, a tension in the servants' posture, a delay in their responses. Pages walked more softly. Courtiers kept their conversations low. There was a change in the rhythm of things, like a drumbeat skipping every fourth note. In one diary, buried deep in the archives of Westminster, an attendant wrote only this: the candles burn faster. The child sleeps too long. There is a change in the wind. The physicians began to argue. Quietly at first. Then louder. One insisted on purging. A tradition as old as bloodletting. Perhaps the child was imbalanced, too much cold humor, too much phlegm. Leeches could restore the body's harmony. Another proposed cauterization. A small iron pressed to the feet. To awaken the nerves, stir the body to resist sloth. A third, more modern, called it nonsense. He had read new tracts from Italy, texts that described infant fevers and recommended warmth, rest, clean milk. But they were not doctors of the child. They were men bound by fear. Fear of telling the king. No one wanted to be the one to speak the words, "Something is wrong." Because Henry had begun to behave strangely again. He no longer wept over the boy. He watched him in silence. Too still, too long. He refused to let the child out of his sight. Once, when a maid reached to change the prince's blanket, Henry slapped her hand away without speaking. So the palace waited. And while they waited, the child grew quieter. His limbs, once quick to twitch in sleep, now barely stirred. His breath became shallow. The flush in his cheeks faded. And still, no one dared speak it. They whispered about it in the corridors. Behind tapestries. By the chapel steps. "It's just the winter," someone would say. "The fires will warm him. He's teething early. He only needs his mother." But each excuse was thinner than the last. In truth, they all felt it, that crawling dread that builds behind the spine, the one that comes not from a scream, but from the absence of one. There is no scream more terrifying than the one that doesn't come when it should. Because babies are meant to cry. And when they do not, the world starts to break. If you're still watching and haven't subscribed to Disturbing Tale, you're letting history whisper while you remain silent. Give this story your voice. Hit subscribe, or step into the comments and admit you turned your back on the moment the silence began. The storm began just after Vespers. Wind tore across the Thames like a beast without eyes, battering the stained glass windows until they shivered in their lead veins. The shutters groaned. The fires hissed. Outside, trees bowed low as if in mourning, their bare branches scraping the palace walls like fingernails against stone. Inside, the cradle was too quiet. No cries. No movement. No sound but the muffled thunder outside and the low crackle of a fire that had grown tired from burning too long. The nurse placed her hand on the child's chest. She waited. And waited. Then, too softly to panic, she whispered, "Fetch the doctor." By the time the physician arrived, the baby had begun to wheeze. A thin, rattling breath, wet and uneven. His lips had paled to a shade somewhere between wax and ash. His tiny hands, once so restless, now curled gently toward his chest like pressed flowers. A page was sent for the king. But Henry did not come immediately. He was in prayer, or perhaps in denial. Perhaps he had been told too many times that all was well. Or perhaps he simply could not face the truth. By the time his boots struck the nursery floor, the room was frozen in place. The queen was already seated beside the cradle, rocking forward and back, not with rhythm, but with shock. Her fingers were red from clawing at the folds of her gown. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. The nurse stood in the corner, blood on her apron, eyes fixed on the floor. A priest held a silver cross over the infant's body, whispering words that had lost their shape. And in the center of it all, in a cradle that had once been warmed by hopes too heavy for a child to bear, the prince lay still. Henry did not speak. He stepped forward. Reached in. And lifted his son, his heir, his blood, his answer to war and God and legacy, into his arms. The child was cold. Not corpse cold. Not yet. But the warmth was leaving. You could feel it in the way his skin resisted the king's touch, in the way his head lolled too easily, like it no longer remembered how to hold the world. Henry pressed his face to the boy's, searching for a whisper of breath, for a heartbeat, for a sign that the nightmare could still be reversed. But there was nothing. No final cry. No gasp. No miracle. Just the storm outside. And the silence inside. 2 kingdoms collapsing at once. Henry's shoulders buckled. Not with the grace of tragedy, but with the jagged, animal sob of a man who had been promised eternity and handed a corpse. He wept. He screamed. He begged. And the child did not wake. Catherine reached out to touch the boy's face. Her hand hovered. Then stopped. And slowly, with a sound not quite human, she collapsed to the floor, her knees giving way as if the weight of her loss had suddenly doubled in the room. Servants turned their heads. Nobles stepped back. No one moved forward. They had seen kings crowned. They had seen queens married. But they had never seen a monarch shatter. And that night, he did. Because this wasn't just a death. It was an infection. It didn't stop with the body. It seeped into the walls. Into the court. Into the king's marrow. Into the faith he once wore like armor. It twisted his grief into hunger. His fear into fury. His doubt into dogma. That cradle didn't just hold a baby. It held a trigger. And now, England would pay the price. We just watched a king shatter. And if you can't feel that, you probably shouldn't be watching Disturbing Tale. Unless, of course, you want to argue your case in the comments section. They dressed him in white. White, not for purity, but for mourning. In Tudor England, white was the color of death for children. And so the body of Prince Henry, Duke of Cornwall, barely 2 moons old, was wrapped not in royal crimson or kingly blue, but in spectral white silks, laced with gold thread, stiff with ritual. His coffin was custom-made, though hastily. Carved from English oak, lined in velvet, inlaid with mother-of-pearl. On the lid, a gold cross flanked by tiny cherubs, their hands folded in permanent grief. The night before the funeral, every candle in Richmond Palace was lit. There were thousands. The halls glowed as if the sun itself had descended in protest. Courtiers stood in silence, eyes cast down, hands trembling. Some wept openly. Some whispered psalms. Some simply stared at the small, still bundle laid atop a bier too large for his size. It looked wrong. Everything looked wrong. Because this was not how a Tudor heir was supposed to leave the world. He was meant to be crowned at Westminster. Meant to lead armies. Break treaties. Build cathedrals. Father heirs. Instead, he was carried by 6 knights who had sworn oaths to protect a life already gone. The procession wound slowly from Richmond to Westminster Abbey. Through cobbled streets lined with mourners, peasants, merchants, friars, widows. People who had never seen the child. Who had never heard his cry. But who now stood barefoot in the February mud, heads bowed, mouths trembling with prayers they barely understood. The air reeked of wax and rain. Some threw rose petals. Others clutched relics, hoping the child's death might bring miracles. Hoping his passing would not be in vain. The coffin, though tiny, moved like a mountain through the crowd. Not because of its weight, but because of what it carried with it. 1,000 dreams. A generation's worth of peace. The fragile illusion that England had finally escaped the teeth of its own history. And behind the coffin, Henry and Catherine. Pale, broken, faceless beneath heavy veils. The king's fists clenched so tight they left crescent moons in his palms. The queen unable to lift her head. They walked as ghosts beside their son. Inside Westminster, the funeral was magnificent and unbearable. Towers of lilies and black banners. Incense so thick it choked. Choirs whose voices cracked with cold. The archbishop's sermon echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling, but his words were empty. No doctrine could explain this. No verse could stitch the wound. And as the coffin was lowered into the crypt, a space never meant to hold kings so small, the walls of the abbey seemed to recoil. Not from grief, but from fear. Because every man in that room knew, this wasn't just the burial of a baby. It was the death of stability. The death of certainty. The death of peace. In that moment, the Tudor line looked brittle again. The ghosts of York stirred. The old wounds gaped. The question was back, what now? If the heir could die, what else could collapse? Who would rise? Who would dare? And in that fear, in that tension, the seeds of future bloodshed were quietly sown. Not with swords, but with silence. If you've stood through this funeral and still haven't subscribed to Disturbing Tale, ask yourself, did you really mourn with us? Or are you just passing by the grave like all the others? Click that button. And if not, step into the comments and confess why a dead prince didn't move you. Something broke between them. Not all at once, but like a hairline fracture deep beneath polished marble. Invisible at first, until pressure made it split. Until silence became sharper than words. After the funeral, Henry and Catherine returned to the same palace, but not the same bed. The chamber remained cold. Not from winter, but from absence. The absence of a child. The absence of warmth. The absence of hope. Henry took to wandering the halls at night, pausing outside the nursery, listening for a sound he would never hear again. Sometimes he entered, sat beside the empty cradle, and stared at it like a battlefield. As if victory had once rested there. As if it had betrayed him. Catherine, meanwhile, prayed harder than ever. The death of her son had become a crucible. A punishment, perhaps. Or a test. She filled her days with relics, rosaries, and ritual. She fasted. She wept before statues. She wrote letters to Spanish confessors, begging them to tell her what sin had turned God's face away from her womb. But none of it changed what had already passed. And worse, it changed what had once bound them. Henry had once found comfort in Catherine's grace, her Spanish pride, her quiet faith. Now, her piety became a mirror he could no longer face. Every time she spoke of God's will, he heard accusation. Every glance from her felt like judgment. They tried again, of course. In the way that royals must. But the tension followed them into bed, tight and breathless. The passion once rooted in triumph was now buried beneath guilt. He blamed her body. She blamed her soul. And in the silence after, they each turned away. The court noticed. They always notice. Whispers rose like fog, the queen is aging. The king no longer smiles in her presence. The line is still broken. And in the void left behind, new eyes began to watch him. Anne Boleyn, sharp, young, unreadable, entered court like a gust of foreign wind. Not yet queen. Not even mistress. But present. Watching. Listening. She saw what Catherine refused to see, that the bond was dying. She watched as Henry began to smile again, but not at his wife. She watched as frustration turned to longing. As longing turned to obsession. As obsession, fed by loss, by prophecy, by ego, turned to revolution. The cracks in their marriage were not just personal. They were political. They were sacred. They were dangerous. Because when a king no longer shares a bed with his queen, the entire country sleeps uneasy. This wasn't just a broken marriage. It was a prelude. A quiet, festering tremor beneath the skin of England that would soon erupt into annulment, heresy, beheadings, war. And it all began here. With a child's coffin. With two people who once ruled together, now unable to even look at each other without remembering what was missing. You've just seen the first rupture. The moment love curdled into politics, and grief carved a throne in half. If you can feel that wound and still haven't subscribed to Disturbing Tale, what exactly are you waiting for? Speak your mind below, or claim your place among those brave enough to remember. He once knelt before the altar like a child begging forgiveness. Henry VIII, crowned with divine right, was raised to believe that God chose kings, and in return, kings upheld God's order. There was no doubt in him, not at first. He prayed daily, heard Mass with devotion, funded monasteries, touched relics, sang hymns. He believed his crown sat firm because his soul did. But when the cradle emptied, when the cries fell silent, when the boy who was supposed to cement his legacy was lowered into the earth, something shifted. At first, it was quiet. A twitch beneath the surface. A hesitancy when crossing himself. A pause before kissing the crucifix. He began to ask questions his priests couldn't answer. Why would God punish me? Why would a child, pure and untouched, be taken from me? Why would a queen so devout continue to fail? And behind these questions was a darker one, never spoken aloud: what if God has turned his back on me? That thought, poisonous, unbearable, sank deep. And what Henry could not confront in the divine, he began to confront in the earthly. The priests. The bishops. The Pope. They were supposed to be God's hands on earth. But they had no answers. No prophecies. No miracles. Just incense, bloodletting, and empty reassurances. He started to see it for what it was, the theater of devotion. The robes. The rituals. The chants. All the gilded tools that failed to save his child. If the church could not protect his son, if the church could not give him another, then what power did it truly hold? And so, like a man betrayed by a lover, Henry turned on God. Not in blasphemy, no. That would be too crude. He turned with strategy. With fury masked as reform. He began to write. Study. Debate. He filled his chambers with scholars who questioned papal authority. He sent envoys to Italy, France, Wittenberg, anywhere someone whispered that Rome could be wrong. This wasn't just policy. This was grief transformed into vengeance. He sought control, over his throne, over his marriage, over his soul. And the church stood in the way. And so began the slow burn of Reformation. Not out of theological conviction. Not out of academic clarity. But because a baby died, and with him died the illusion that divine favor could be trusted. Infant mortality had always haunted the medieval world. But for kings, it wasn't just tragedy. It was threat. It was spiritual humiliation. And for Henry, it was unforgivable. Because if God allowed a Tudor prince to die, if God allowed his bloodline to teeter on extinction, then either God was not paying attention, or God had become an obstacle. One that had to be removed. He didn't burn churches. Not yet. He didn't denounce the Virgin or tear down the saints. Not at first. But the moment he questioned God's fidelity, he unlatched a door that could never be closed again. And from that door came a wind that would sweep through England, toppling monasteries, dissolving marriages, executing heretics, rewriting scripture, reshaping history. It started not with a declaration, but with a cradle. And the silence that followed. If you've followed Henry this far and still haven't subscribed to Disturbing Tale, you're witnessing the birth of a tyrant and letting it vanish into the fog. Give this story its weight. Subscribe now, or tell us in the comments why you're content to watch the world change without leaving a mark. He did not become a tyrant overnight. It began with grief. Then obsession. Then a quiet, corrosive rage that no crown could soothe and no chapel could contain. The annulment came first. Not as scandal, but as necessity. That was the language Henry used. Necessity. To dissolve what God had supposedly joined. To erase the queen who had failed him. To rewrite the promise of permanence with ink drawn from disappointment. But behind every legal argument, every ecclesiastical debate, every letter dispatched to Rome, there was still that ghost in the cradle. The one who hadn't lived long enough to inherit a crown, but lingered long enough to destroy it. Henry's enemies would call him the English Nero. His friends, when they dared speak truth, called him changed. But only Henry knew, he hadn't changed. He had been broken. And now he was rebuilding himself, harder, colder, sharper. And Boleyn became queen. Then fell. Jane Seymour bled to death after giving him a son, the son that should have been his first. And of Cleves was annulled. Catherine Howard was beheaded. Catherine Parr lived, but only by her silence. 6 wives. 2 executed. 1 died in childbirth. All haunted. And in the shadow of every wife. The boy. The one who didn't survive long enough to ruin anything. The one who, by dying, opened the door to everything Henry became. Parliament bent. The Church of England rose. Monasteries burned. More than 800 religious houses dissolved. Thousands of monks and nuns cast into the street. Altars desecrated. Relics shattered. Holy water turned to ash. His former advisors fell like dominoes. Thomas More, executed. Cardinal Fisher, executed. Cromwell, executed. Men who once whispered in his ear now died by his hand. The people called him majestic. Then monstrous. Then both. And through it all, he still looked for signs. Signs that God had forgiven him. Signs that his son's death had meaning. But none ever came. So he filled the silence with fire. With blade. With law. With blood. Because if heaven had turned its face away, Henry would no longer kneel. He would rise. And rule alone. Every decision, every death, every exile, echoed with that first loss. He did not just bury his son. He buried the version of himself that believed love could protect legacy. And in its place, he built a throne out of bones and fear. Even in his final years, swollen with illness, his mind returned to the boy. Whispers from attendants describe Henry clutching his belly and muttering, "He should have ruled. He should have lived. Why did God take him and leave me?" He was still haunted. Because the truth is this, that child never left. He sat beside Henry in every marriage. He stood behind Henry at every execution. He knelt with Henry before every broken altar. He was the first ghost. And the last trace of the man Henry might have been. If you made it this far into disturbing tale and felt the weight of every life lost, every altar burned, and every queen silenced, but you still won't subscribe, then maybe you should just admit it in the comments. Say it proudly. I watched it all, and walked away. What if he had lived? What if 52 days had turned into 50 years? What if Prince Henry, the firstborn, the heir, the boy cradled like prophecy, had grown? No Anne Boleyn. No Reformation. No heads on the block. No smoke curling from the ruins of abbeys and monasteries. No whispers of heresy. No Elizabeth I, no Virgin Queen, no Gloriana, no golden age gilded by conquest and cannon fire. If the child had survived, history as you know it would collapse like parchment left in rain. Catherine of Aragon would have remained queen, not discarded like old parchment, but revered, untouchable. There would have been no question of annulment, no appeals to Rome, no break from the Church, no need for England to sever its spiritual backbone. The Church of England would not exist. And with it, no religious wars, no martyrs burned at Smithfield, no flight of scholars, no Tudor purges masked in sacred purpose. No reordering of scripture, no desecration of saints, no rewriting of God's will in the language of kings. Instead, perhaps, a slow peace. An alliance with Spain made unbreakable. France checked by blood, not battle. A dynasty steadied, not scattered. But he did not live. He died with no words, no laws, no throne. And yet, his absence was louder than his cries. He left no speech. No army. No portrait aged beyond swaddling cloth. And still, the world cracked around the hole he left behind. His death became the wound England built its future around. Anne Boleyn rose because of it. Elizabeth I was born because of it. Empires were seated because of it. Churches burned, queens died, kings trembled, because of it. Because one boy's lungs failed before his crown could find his head. It's easy to imagine history as a march of powerful men. But sometimes, it's the smallest, quietest figures, the ones who never ruled, never spoke, never chose, who shaped the earth with the most violent silence. Sometimes the ones who never rule, leave the deepest scars on the world. If that truth hit you somewhere you didn't expect, and you've walked every step of this shadowed road with us, subscribe to Disturbing Tale. Let these forgotten voices echo where they were once silenced. Or if you choose silence instead, go to the comments. Say it boldly, I watched a child change the world, and turned away.